My interest in the subject matter of women and aging was inspired by my own obsession with popular culture. I was a soap opera obsessed child and teenager, and then that moved into being really into reality television. And what I noticed in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s was that, particularly with soap opera figures, female figures that I had been familiar with since my childhood, who were now mothers and grandmothers, their faces had not aged at all in terms of changes in their physical appearance, in terms of any indicators of aging on their faces. And I was intrigued and a little bit troubled and disturbed by this as I began to notice just how unchanged their faces were over time and how little they reflect biological progression of the body and of time. It was a combination of my interest in popular culture, noting the prevalence of ageless faces, particularly among women in the soap opera landscape and then the reality television landscape, and for the first time noticing that women in particular were being targeted with these anti-aging cosmetic technologies, injectables, and surgeries too. I really kind of moved on from there, wanting to begin to explore, how and in what ways the kind of cosmetic anti-aging boom and our just more general youth-saturated culture was interacting with and affecting everyday women's own perceptions and attitudes and approaches to aging and to growing older. We have this landscape where particularly women in their 30s and older are being targeted with cosmetic anti-aging procedures and technologies via very aggressive marketing campaigns and direct-to-consumer advertising and television and print media, on the internet, also in doctors' offices, so at primary care doctors' offices, at gynecologists' offices, at dermatologists' offices. What you'll see is a lot of billboard advertising, brochure advertising, and marketing for cosmetic anti-aging procedures. And if we look historically, we didn't have this kind of advertising and direct-to-consumer advertising before 1997 in the United States. So that was sort of part of the hook for me was, wow, how and in what ways is the kind of saturation of advertising that women are experiencing around cosmetic anti-aging procedures interacting with and informing and maybe changing how they themselves feel about growing older and particularly about changes in appearance due to aging in their faces and on their bodies. When you look at the data and the statistics around who's having cosmetic anti-aging surgeries and technologies, the consumers, the patients, the recipients are overwhelmingly female. And what's interesting is that really hasn't changed since we've started keeping statistics on procedures in the United States. So since 1997, basically, women continue to account for 90% of all individuals who are having both surgical and non-surgical cosmetic anti-aging procedures. And while there have been some predictions that men are going to start having more of these procedures in greater numbers, particularly as they become more accessible, more user-friendly, that really hasn't been the case. It really has remained steady around 10% of men who are consuming these anti-aging procedures and around 90% of women. Also, just when you look at other data pertaining to age discrimination and ageism more generally, what we see is a real intersection of ageism and sexism playing out in terms of women experiencing greater penalties around looking older than men are in the workforce and the personal realm. Data that indicates that it's much more difficult for women to remarry after divorce if they're 45 or older versus men. Data that shows that while men and women both experience age discrimination in the workforce, women experience that age discrimination sooner at younger ages. And there's a whole host of data that indicates the ways in which age discrimination is gendered and in ways in which that gendering really negatively is affecting women. So my sample of women is predominantly white, middle and upper middle class, with a significant minority of individual women who are low income. We would describe them as low income. They were, again, majority white, just one Latina woman. And part of the reason that I chose the sample that I did is very much reflective of kind of the key demographic that's being targeted by the anti-aging surgery industry and by the anti-aging pharmaceutical industry. So when you look at the advertisements, when you see the imagery, when you hear the narratives, it really is the white, middle, upper middle class woman, middle age and older, who's being targeted. So I really wanted to talk to these women because these are the women who are being very consciously and in very savvy ways targeted by the industry itself. And certainly when we think about the lack of racial diversity in my sample, race is very much, I think, an absent presence that haunts my sample, and that certainly haunts the industry overall. It is very much still predominantly white and female in terms of who's having cosmetic procedures in general, and who's having cosmetic anti-aging procedures. And it's also, we can think about race and racialization in terms of the kinds of procedures that Anglo women are having, and then the kinds of procedures that African American women are having, that Asian American women are having, and that Latinx women are having. So there is a very racialized component to who's having what procedures and why that's incredibly troubling, and something that I note in my introduction, and that there is growing research around looking at the racialization of the phenomenon of cosmetic surgery in general, cosmetic intervention in general. But for my work, because I was really interested in cosmetic anti-aging procedures and women who are having these procedures, I really wanted to target the demographic that's being targeted by the industry. So that was my motivation for selecting the women that I did select. Among the women who are having and using cosmetic anti-aging procedures, including injectables like Botox and Juvederm and collagen mimics and things like that, and straightforward surgical procedures like neck lifts and facelifts and eye lifts, one thing that I heard over and over again from these women was that they really just felt like they didn't look like themselves any longer, and that it was very uncomfortable and alienating for them to see the changes in their appearance, and that, their sense of who they were inside and how they looked outside was becoming increasingly disconnected. So I thought that was really interesting. A lot of women talked about having the injections and having the surgeries to sort of reconnect or reattach how they looked physically with their inner sense of who they were, or their authentic self. So I thought that was really interesting. A lot of women talked about being upset by how they looked in two-dimensional images, which I also thought was really interesting, and the prospect of being photographed at a wedding or a bat mitzvah, or an important familial event in one's life would often motivate the particular woman to engage in her first foray into having these kinds of procedures. So again, just I think interesting from the perspective of the society we're living in now, wherein so much of our daily life is mediated via screens, and so much of our identity is being constructed via the two-dimensional realm. And that's certainly more and more and more true among young adults, among the students that I'm teaching in college, and among teenagers, and even among children now, that so much of identity construction is happening vis-a-vis the screen. So I thought that was interesting, that was very much a prevalent theme. Invisibility was a huge theme among women who decided to have cosmetic anti-aging procedures and surgeries, particularly women who were in the workforce, and feeling like when they looked a certain age, even though they themselves felt more confident and like they had garnered more wisdom and experience over time, they felt, and they articulated to me, that they felt like people stopped asking for their advice. People sort of stopped looking to them as somebody who would have something of import to share. They felt like they were being passed over for positions and promotions because of looking older, even though they felt like they had more to offer than some of the younger or newer employees. And then for other women who are having the procedures done, they talked about invisibility as well, but it was more along the lines of feeling like people didn't see them as an attractive woman any longer because they looked a certain age, and really feeling the loss in that and wanting to have procedures done so that they would still be read or perceived as attractive physically. So that definitely was a theme as well. And one other thing I would just share with the women about the women who were having the procedures done, what I thought was really interesting too was a lot of them used what we would call a progress narrative to describe their decision to have cosmetic anti-aging procedures. They actually said that, that now that they were older, they realized that looks mattered for women, and it was something they had maybe tried to resist against in their younger years, but they realized that, it's just a reality. And they sort of are like framing it as that now that I'm in my 60s and I'm older and wiser, I realize, looks really do matter for women. And looking young for women really does matter. And we just need to wake up and smell the coffee, face reality, and that's why I'm doing this. So I thought that was really interesting. And then also using a progress narrative around aging, not only this idea of I finally realized I have to just accept the harsh reality, looks matter, but also this idea of giving myself a gift or a treat, doing something just for me. A few women got their first procedures done after they retired or after their children went off to college, and they felt like there was more time and room in their daily lives for thinking about themselves and what I want. We could trouble over that from another perspective that, how is it that women are giving gifts to themselves, which are about, going under the knife or being injected with things to look younger and conform to the youth beauty aesthetic, and that may be limiting in some respects, but certainly in terms of how they experienced it, it was self-esteem building, empowering, confidence building, and rewarding. So I thought that was interesting as well. The other side, the women who are growing older naturally, they also experienced all the ageism that the women who are having the procedures experience in terms of invisibility, in terms of people, saying that they didn't recognize them any longer. I mean, that's not so much ageism per se, but just the discomfort in looking older and how people are responding to you. The women who are growing older naturally talked a lot about feeling alienated from how their faces and bodies looked. They were very open and honest about the challenges and the difficulties of witnessing, age-centered or age-driven changes on their faces and bodies. But for them, they really read the aging process as a natural process and as a biological process, and one that they didn't feel like they wanted to interfere with technologically. So by understanding the changes as naturally driven and as centered around biology, they were able to destigmatize them and kind of depathologize them, which is really interesting because for the women who are having procedures, they found the technology is really comforting and like, I'm going to fight aging every step of the way. But for my natural aging group, they really felt like, why should I have to treat these natural changes as a symptom, as something to be fixed, as something to be interfered with? It's not a disease, it's not a pathology, it's something that happens to all of us, it's a universal phenomenon. Why should I feel the need to interfere with it or to, fix it or fight it with technology? They were also working hard to reframe it and see some of the ways wherein as women, not being read as immediately as a sex object or having to worry about how attractive they looked and attracting the male gaze or being the uncomfortable recipient of the male gaze. In that, they really articulated this new opportunity for freedom and freedom to develop new aspects of themselves. So really doing really exciting identity development outside of the role of the sort of woman as, being attractive and the sex object identities. Generally, they talked about aging as progress and ways in which they felt like they were wiser and gaining more experience with time. And that was another way that they were able to feel better about the changes on their faces and bodies, which I thought was really interesting because they were able to read them as reflective of lived experience and wisdom and emotions felt over time. For the natural agers, the prospect of cosmetic anti-aging intervention was disturbing from the perspective of interfering with and even erasing parts of their authentic self. So they felt very connected to the changes in their faces and bodies, even though they at times, were upset by them. The thought of erasing wrinkles or eliminating sags and bags and gray hair was fundamentally upsetting because they read those changes in their faces and bodies as reflective of their lived lives over time. Really, one of the constant and continuous themes that I heard over and over and over again is just how difficult it is for a woman in contemporary United Statesian society to grow older and feel okay about it, and to look older and feel okay about it. Just the stigma that continuously is experienced, the ways in which women who look older are experiencing invisibility, the ageism, all of that. When we have women who are being bombarded with all the marketing and the advertising around the technologies that they could say yes to, and just the narratives in the advertising campaigns and the marketing are so savvy, I think it's just important to note that it may be harder now in 2017 for a woman to grow older naturally and see the aging on her face and body than it was, 40, 50 years ago in the United States. And I think that a large part of that I gleaned from listening to women's stories was the fact that we have all these cosmetic anti-aging options today. So what I think is interesting is that it becomes more and more and more difficult for women to say no to these procedures and to feel okay about aging naturally without them, without being read as, irrational or impractical for not using them and for not saying yes to them. So one theme that came up again across the entirety of my sample that women talked a lot about, whether they were having procedures, refusing procedures, or whether they were undecided about whether they would or would not have procedures, was the advertising, the media coverage of new cosmetic anti-aging surgeries and technologies, and also just more generally our youth-saturated culture. But these were general themes. What I thought was really interesting is that the women that I talked to didn't just talk about the fact that they were being bombarded with advertisements and marketing, for anti-aging surgeries and technologies. They actually talked a lot about the narratives that were in the marketing and that were in the advertising. And those narratives were so savvy and so interesting. One thing that we saw a lot and that women talked a lot about too was the ways in which it was, doctors who were being featured in the advertisements, the ways in which the advertising was using medical language a lot, other themes that women talked about in my interviews and that I've seen in my own analyses of advertisements and marketing around cosmetic procedures and anti-aging procedures are themes that center on, individualism, on freedom of expression, on common sense, on rationality. So just the savviness of the campaigns, the narratives. But I just wanted to come back to this concept of the medicalization of aesthetics, which was an underlying theme among my respondents, and just that we see in the advertising and marketing campaigns for cosmetic anti-aging procedures. And I think it's a really important concept, just in a very basic sense, because what it's about is medicalizing something that was otherwise understood as a normal, natural bodily phenomenon. Right? So when something is medicalized, we then begin to see it obviously as something that should be treated. We read it as a symptom. We read it as something that should be intervened with and fixed in some way that's medical, a medical prescription for this problem. And that's been a whole very successful and very powerful part of the narrative around how cosmetic anti-aging surgeries and technologies have been marketed to the women and to the populace that I was interviewing in particular.